On the 10th of October, 2023, a small convoy pulled up beside a flooded creek in West London, carrying 5 animals that hadn't called this city home in roughly 400 years. By the next morning, 2 adults and 3 young kids would be released into a 20-acre park called Paradise Fields, and somewhere nearby, at Greenford Tube Station, sandbags still lined the corridor from the last heavy rain. Nobody watching that release could have said with any certainty whether it would work. For centuries, this land had managed its water without them. Beavers were hunted out of Britain long before anyone thought to ask what their absence might eventually cost. And what it cost, it turned out, was measured in flooded platforms, waterlogged streets, and engineers quietly drawing up plans for concrete reservoirs the city could barely afford. My name is Ranger Emily. I've spent much of my career watching landscapes change, sometimes by human hand. If stories like this move you, I'd love for you to like this video and subscribe. There are more of them ahead. To understand why a family of rodents was trusted with a job engineers couldn't solve, we have to go back to where this species nearly disappeared for good. To understand what beavers were being asked to fix, you have to understand what Britain had already lost. Walk through almost any lowland landscape in this country today, and what you're seeing isn't wild in the way it once was. It's drained, straightened, channeled, managed into behaving. And there's a number that still stops me every time I say it out loud. More than 95% of the UK's wetlands are gone. Not damaged, gone. That's not a distant, abstract loss. Wetlands were once the landscape's own flood defense, a network of marsh, bog, and slow-moving water that could absorb heavy rain the way a sponge absorbs a spill. Drain that system, straighten those rivers, and water no longer has anywhere patient to go. It just runs, faster, harder, and increasingly into places never built to hold it. That's the quiet backstory behind Greenford's flooded platforms and sandbagged corridors. This wasn't really a story about one tube station. It was a symptom of a landscape that had lost most of its natural capacity to manage water. Around the same time, it lost the one animal that had spent millions of years doing exactly that job for free. Which raises the obvious question. If beavers had once done this work automatically, why did it take Britain 4 centuries to consider asking them back? It's worth pausing here because it would be easy to tell this story as a simple triumph. It isn't quite that simple. Not everyone welcomed the beavers back the way London did. In Scotland, where the reintroduced population has been free to spread beyond fenced parks and onto working farmland, the return hasn't always felt like good news. Kate Maitland represents Scotland's National Farmers Union, and she's spent enough time on flooded farmland to see the other side of this story clearly. Beavers, she explains, don't just build dams and rivers, they'll dam irrigation channels too. Channels farmers depend on to keep water moving off their fields, not pooling on top of them. When a beaver decides otherwise, the results can be significant. It's quite devastating, Maitland says, to see acres and acres of your land sitting underwater. That's not a minor inconvenience. That's a season's income sitting submerged. It's a reminder that rewilding isn't a switch you flip without consequence. An animal that can reshape a landscape for the better can just as easily reshape it into someone's problem. And in Scotland, that tension is still being worked out, farm by farm, dam by dam, which is exactly why what happened next in London mattered so much. Because this time, conservationists had learned something from Scotland's growing pains, and they weren't about to repeat them. To picture how this worked, it helps to picture the land itself. Paradise Fields sits just north of Greenford Tube Station, 20 acres that, until recently, were still laid out as a golf course, with a single creek threading quietly through the middle of it. On a map, it looks unremarkable. Green space, a thin blue line of water, a station a short walk away. But water doesn't care how a map looks, it cares about gradient. And that creek, however modest it seemed, was part of the same system that eventually reached the station's ticket office whenever the rain came down hard enough. This is the detail most people miss about urban flooding. It rarely starts where the flooding happens. It starts upstream, in smaller channels most residents never notice, gathering speed and volume before it ever reaches a platform or a doorway. So when conservationists looked at that creek running through Paradise Fields, they weren't just looking at a nice water feature in a park. They were looking at the beginning of the problem, and they hoped the beginning of the solution. Because if you could slow the water here, at the source, you might never need sandbags at the station at all. Which is exactly the theory 2 adults and 3 kits were about to test. The theory held. But what happened next surprised even the people who designed the project. The Beavers didn't just dam the creek, they felled trees along its banks, opening gaps in a canopy that had grown thick and closed for years. Sunlight reached the ground again, and in ecology, sunlight rarely stays unclaimed for long. Freshwater shrimp turned up in the creek in water that hadn't supported them before. Then came the birds. 8 new species recorded in Paradise Fields since the beavers arrived, drawn in by habitat that simply hadn't existed the year before. 2 species of bats followed, hunting the insects that now had somewhere to breed. And along the blackthorn shrubs the beavers had nibbled and reshaped, a rare butterfly began laying its eggs. The brown hairstreak, a species that depends on exactly that kind of disturbed, sunlit hedge growth to survive. None of this was engineered. No one released shrimp or planted for butterflies. The beavers simply did what beavers do: felling, damming, flooding, opening, and the rest of the ecosystem quietly filled in around them. It's worth sitting with that for a second. 5 animals, doing nothing but behaving like beavers, had rebuilt habitat for creatures that had nothing to do with flooding at all. That plan is no longer on the table. With the creek now slowed, diverted, and spread across a network of beaver-built ponds and wetlands, the flood risk downstream had already dropped, measurably, and without a single contractor on site. Sean McCormick, who has overseen the project, put it plainly: the beavers could do the job the council had been planning to pay for, and do it for a fraction of the cost, certainly more sustainably. So the reservoir was scrapped, not postponed. Scrapped. It's a strange thing, watching a multi-million-pound infrastructure plan get quietly shelved because 5 animals were doing the work for free. I've covered a lot of conservation stories in my career, but I don't think I've seen one where the accountants and the ecologists ended up agreeing so completely. Which leaves one last question worth asking. Now that it's worked, what comes next for London and for everywhere else, still waiting for its own flood to arrive? What strikes me most, looking back, isn't the flooding that stopped. It's how little humans actually had to do to stop it. We spent 4 centuries engineering around a problem that a family of animals solved simply by being allowed to exist. That's the part of this story I think about most. Not as a wildlife success, but as a quiet correction. Somewhere along the way, we started assuming that fixing broken landscapes required more machinery, more concrete, more control. This project suggests the opposite might sometimes be true. Sometimes restoration isn't about adding something new. It's about giving back what we removed and having the patience to let it work. I keep returning to one image from this story. A pond that didn't exist 2 years ago, built by nobody, holding back water that once reached a train station a mile away. So I'll leave you with this. How many other problems are we still trying to engineer our way out of when the solution walked out of Britain's rivers 400 years ago? If stories like this matter to you, I hope you'll subscribe. There are more out there. The water still remembers where it wants to go. We just forgot to ask.